Before we begin, let me just say, echo what Dr. Black has said for the last couple of weeks. We understand that we are white academics, we are European academics. We are coming to this as co-learners with everybody on the journey. We understand that we do not come from a marginalized background that we are discussing, and we know that that can be sensitive. And that's why we invite you to participate, not just in Q&A, but also if you have an idea for a presentation, please join us like you saw we did with Puerto Rico. And another disclaimer, again, there are pictures that are problematic both racially and sexually in language in this presentation. So know that some of these could make people uncomfortable. So today we're going to be talking about the Harlem Renaissance. This is part one of a two-parter, as I said. Harlem Renaissance, more than just art. We're going to look at the cultural movement, and that has a historic context as well as a cultural context. We're going to talk about key figures, the works, and that'll lead us into part two, the influences and the long-lasting influences of the Harlem Renaissance. Part of the context that I'd like to share is what's known as the Atlanta Compromise. This happened in 1895, and you've probably heard the name Booker T. Washington, and he was part of the Tuskegee Institute. Well, in 1885, he gave a famous and controversial speech in Atlanta, and basically this is what has come to be known as accommodation, that he basically was offering a deal on behalf of Southern African Americans to Southern European Americans, saying, if you provide us with education and healthcare and jobs, we will stop talking about and stop advocating for voting rights and civil rights. You can imagine how controversial that was. And that's part of the context for what becomes known as the Great Migration. The Great Migration is a movement, it's a massive movement of African Americans from the south and the southern part of the United States to the northern part of the United States. Now, we're going to be talking particularly about Harlem in New York City, but this transcends just one section of one borough of the city. And this continues for decades and decades, this gradual migration of African Americans out of the south and into the north. And there are different motivations. As I said, there's the rejection of accommodation. There's the trying to get away from Jim Crow, which we talked about a few weeks ago. But by the time World War I begins, there's also there are more jobs in the North, which draws people further north for the Great Migration. The new Negro movement, as it was called, the Harlem Renaissance was called at the time, is based on a book by the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, Dr. Alan Locke. And in this book, he has collections by other prominent African Americans, and two of which we're going to talk about later, the editor, Alan Locke, and Langston Hughes.
So with this migration from the south to the north, it's progress for African Americans, progress for Black Americans. The north, the artists, the writers, the thinkers, the musicians are all excited, and people from the south are moving in droves by the thousands. But as we know from our presentation on Jim Crow a few weeks ago, it wasn't seen as a positive by everyone. And so you do have a backlash. If we look at this newspaper article from the Chicago Tribune in 1917, you can see it's highly problematic. The article itself is talking very positively about the migration from the south to the north for African Americans. However, there are still bits, the very blatant bits of latent racism if we look at the title of this headline. And then in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from 1918 on the right, you have people claiming that these African Americans are moving from the south to the north because they can no longer get drunk and be lazy, quote unquote, in the south anymore. So they're blaming this movement on prohibition, which would come about in a few years more formally. So you do have this sort of backlash, a latent form of backlash in the article on the left, despite the headline, and a very sort of prominent manifest racism, othering of what's happening in the world today, or during the Great Migration.
And I want to just take a moment to say why Harlem, right? Like we know nowadays that Harlem is a well-known Black neighborhood in New York City. Particularly, it's in Upper Manhattan. If you're familiar with New York City, it's between Central Park on the south and Washington Heights in the north. But why Harlem? Harlem was one of the newer developments, one of the newer neighborhoods in New York City at the time. And as a new neighborhood, it had the room to accept new immigrants to the United States and also migrants from the Great Migration of African Americans from the South. So that's why the Harlem Renaissance is located in Harlem.
So why the Harlem Renaissance, right? So it was actually famous thinker and activist W.E.B. Du Bois who looked around Harlem, looked around New York at this time and said, my goodness, we have enough talent here to create a new Renaissance. And so the name Harlem Renaissance eventually is what stuck. Typically, when we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance, we typically talk about it in terms of art history in your art history classes. And we assign the timeline of about 1920s to 1940s. And you'll see here, I've got stars next to those because as you know, in art history, we like to put arbitrary dates and labels on things. And the Harlem Renaissance actually started a little bit earlier with Dr. Locke, and it lasted decades later. And next week, we'll talk about those influences into later decades. But for our purposes today, we're going to talk about the period of about 1920s through 1940s, the African-American cultural movement. This what we talk about as Harlem Renaissance had the tone of celebration, had the tone of acknowledgement, of uplifting community, of acknowledging African heritage and celebrating that. We will talk about some of the leaders listed here and what they did. And as Dr. Keefe mentioned, most of the ideas that developed for the Harlem Renaissance around these artists and entertainers and thinkers is coming from Dr. Locke's book, The New Negro.
There were a lot of Black media sources at the time that supported the artists, the movements, the ideas, this renaissance, this exchange, a cultural diffusion of ideas and energy. In particular, a couple of magazines published by organizations you're probably aware of, the NAACP had a journal called Crisis. National Urban League, you may be familiar with, had a publication called Opportunity. A couple that you might not be as aware of, but first of all, the Messengers. It's important to point out, not just because of the publication, but who was publishing it. It was published by the only all-Black union in the United States, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And then Negro World was published by Marcus Garvey, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, and his Universal Negro Improvement Association. So those voices, they're all part of the same movement, but they have different agendas, they have different ideas. I already spoke about how Booker and the Atlantic Compromise could be described as a combination between the aspirations of the Black community and the political and social power of European Americans. Garvey, who I just mentioned, he's known as a separatist, even a militant, and he was a proponent of back to Africa and emigration. There was a lot of emigration in this time period from the United States in the Black community, not just back to Africa, to Liberia and Sierra Leone and other places, but to more diverse populations in the Caribbean, as well as to Europe, particularly Paris and London. Then there's the integration, which I would describe as coming out of the New Negro, but you can see how the New Negro also influenced MLK and the Southern Leadership Council later. And then there's also militancy. There are people who want to fight. Most famously, we'll talk about this next week in part 2, but the Black Panthers and Nation of Islam. So I just wanted to make sure, we wanted to make sure everybody was aware that there's not a singular voice coming out of the Black community. It is a vibrant discussion, multi-perspective discussion. The National Urban League I mentioned, I also just want to highlight the fact that if you look at who the founders of the National Urban League are, one was African American and one was European American. From the beginning, there have been allies, and we need to honor the allies and the history of allies, as well as the history of the Black lived experiences in the United States. And so Dr. Haynes, by the way, first person to get a PhD from Columbia, and an heiress, Ruth Standish Baldwin, they both founded the National Urban League in 1910, which provided a lot of the logistical support for the schools that opened that led to the Harlem Renaissance.
All right, so buckle up, y'all. Here we go. The father of the Harlem Renaissance, also known as the dean of the Harlem Renaissance. It is his book, Dr. Alain Locke, Oxford-educated thinker, philosopher, writer. He is the gentleman who wrote the book that really started what we call the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro. And as we've briefly mentioned, it's an anthology of all sorts of types of visual art, written art, plays, music, portraiture. And Locke divided this book into two parts, what he calls the Old Negro, which he describes as, quote, a creature of moral debate and historical controversy, right? Think about this idea of the Old Negro as embodying the idea of an enslaved community, right? Historically, for Europeans, enslaved people were talked about as subhuman, less than, having physical characteristics that make them subhuman and less than. He's saying that's the old. The new Negro, what he's writing about and what these works of art in this book are talking about is this celebration and acknowledgement of this new Negro, this self-actualized individual with autonomy and self-determination. Dr. Locke himself being what he felt was this idea of the quote-unquote new Negro. He was a black gay man in the early 20th century, Oxford PhD, a thinker, a philosopher, a civil rights activist. He was this new individual. He was writing about himself.
Before I talk about Marcus Garvey, I want you to first, any thoughts, anything you know about Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X before his renunciation of violence in '64, or Louis Farrakhan. I want you to think about those people. And now I'd like to tell you about Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, also known as the Black Moses, was, as I said, a separatist. He's the leader of the Black nationalist movement. And he's a native of Jamaica. He moved to Harlem, and he developed a following. He started Negro World, which I mentioned before, but he was very controversial, not just because he was a Black nationalist, but how about this? He accepted the basic tenets of the KKK. So you have the KKK being white supremacists and white separatists, and you have Garveyism, Black militants and Black separatists. He eventually was charged with mail fraud, which is a federal felony, and while his sentence was commuted by President Calvin Coolidge, it stayed on the record. When President Obama was in office, there was a movement to pardon officially Marcus Garvey, and that failed. So Marcus Garvey is, in fact, let's take a look at the next slide. You can see you already saw the pizzazz of that hat that he had. He would drive around in a limousine, but look at the showmanship. Look at the number of people present to support him, to just watch what he's doing, or to protest against him. It's reminiscent, if you will, of today, right? That if you think of today, in fact, I'm thinking that in so many ways Dr. Black, I'd like you to jump in here, that it's this ephemera art in a way, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Ephemera is so important to the art of protest, to the art of social change, to art as activism, which I know many of you are interested in and have asked us about. And this ephemera of protest going back to 1921 with the Harlem Renaissance and its sort of different branches. If we didn't have photographs like this, if we didn't keep the posters like the ones shown here from these protests, we would not know the full extent, or wouldn't have such a deep and rich understanding of what these movements and the sort of separatist movements within the larger movements were about. So we want you to think, when you are going out to these protests that are happening right now as we speak everywhere, keep in mind, it's not just marker on cardboard. You are making visual culture of protest, and it's important. So important that RimCAD Library is actually trying to collect ephemera that you guys are making today. These are primary sources of what's going on in our context today, you know, some 100 years later after Garveyism and the beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance. Your social protest ephemera is just as important as a primary source for students 100 years from now to look back and see what you guys were creating and how you are responding to something similar. You're still fighting for rights. You're still fighting for social justice and civil rights. So keep that in mind. And if you have questions about the library collecting these things, contact Martha. She'd be more than happy to talk to you about them. But your ephemera, your protest art is important. Dr. Keefe.
Uh, I was just thinking, and I apologize for the delay, but when I listening to you talk, Dr. Black, I was thinking about how, again, how lucky we are that we have those pictures from Garveyism. And if you forgive the analogy, I was thinking of this as almost like a 1920s police body camera. That if we didn't have these pictures, we wouldn't know what was going on, and it would be easier for other people to control the narratives. So I apologize for losing track of myself and following that thought a little bit. But let's talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. He is another one of the leaders of this movement. If you recognize the name, he was on one of the earlier slides. He was the loudest critic of the Atlantic Compromise and of Booker T. Washington. He's a well-known civil rights leader, activist, and scholar. He's from Massachusetts, which is just north of Rhode Island. However, he later naturalized and became a citizen of Ghana. So if, I mentioned Garveyism also had a tenet of it of back to Africa. While Du Bois was not part of Garveyism, he did take citizenship from a West African nation. He was the first African American to earn his doctorate from Harvard. So we talked about the first Dr. Haynes to be the first doctor from Columbia. We talked about Du Bois being the first doctor from Harvard. But also I want to go back to something that Dr. Black said. Why did Dr. Alan Locke get his degree from Oxford? Yes, Oxford's a prestigious institution, but we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides.
So speaking of Dr. Locke, that was a great transition, Dr. Keefe. In 1900, right? So this is predating the formal dates that we give the Harlem Renaissance. But in 1900, Dr. Alain Locke is looking around, again, all these activists, all these artists, and he's putting these things together. And he goes over to Paris and he puts together this exhibition of the American Negro, right? And that's what it's called, 1900 Paris Exposition. It's works of visual culture, it's photographs, it's written works, it's photographs of lynchings, it's photographs of enslaved people after they're free or enslaved people during slavery. It's showcasing and explaining visually to European audiences the experience of what you call the American Negro in America during the 19th century and early 20th century. This show in Paris exploded. People loved it. They were educated. They were impressed with the artistic skill. Locke himself also created works. I'm sorry, this is W.E.B. Du Bois, and I've been saying Locke the whole time. This was W.E.B. Du Bois who put this exhibition together in Paris. He was a professor at Emory University, so he's an educator, he's an artist, and in 1900, he is putting together these statistics in a visual sort of graphic infograph format of African-American life in Georgia in 1900. And these were on display as well in the exhibition. Show you a few more of his works. Are you kidding me? Look at this. Display of research in an aesthetic manner. You graphic design majors, you graphic designers, you marketers, right? Look at this. Have you seen such modernism in 1900 in visual culture? No, not in the form of social information. Du Bois was doing this in 1900. Take a look at the infograph on the left. It should remind you of something if you've taken Art History 2300, perhaps Piet Mondrian, who didn't do work like this until the 30s at the earliest. His most famous piece, Broadway Boogie Woogie from 1942. Du Bois is doing this in 1900, but abstraction and design for social good, to talk about the Black American experience through infographics, through visual design. So another artist of the Harlem Renaissance that is often, very much often featured in art history textbooks, that I'm sure you've heard his name, is Aaron Douglas. Artist, educator, he later became a critic. He was an activist for African Americans during this time as well. His most notable works include, and we'll talk about both of these, Into Bondage and Aspiration, both created for the state of Texas's centennial, celebrating their independence from Mexico, which is a whole nother talk Dr. Keefe and I could give in terms of underrepresented voices. He also did the illustrations for Alain Locke's book that really started this all, The New Negro. So let's take a look at some of his works. So these two paintings are actually part of 4 original paintings that Douglas did for the Texas Centennial. We only have 2 left. I don't know what happened to the other 2. I encourage you art historians to help me find them. But so Into Bondage on the left is the first part of this series of 4, and it visually speaks to, as you can see, the idea of going into bondage, being taken from Africa through the Middle Passage in the Atlantic slave trade. The image on the right is perhaps Douglas's most famous painting, Aspiration, and oh my goodness. You in the front, you're in the splash zone. Get ready. What you think this painting is about, it's about even more. He has so many sort of little eggs, little treasures throughout this painting. So here we go. I've given you like a legend on the left, but let's talk about it. So if we look at, I don't know if you can see my mouse, we'll start here. These waves, the sort of curvilinear form here, are referencing waves. They lead us to these hands in bondage. And this is, again, talking about the Atlantic slave trade. So we read that as a reference to that. We've got this plinth here in 3 parts. And if you sort of turn your head sideways like this, you'll notice they make triangle shapes, right? Remember what Dr. Keefe said about this idea of ancient Egyptian heritage? Douglas was part of this move to honor ancient Egyptian heritage, African heritage. Writers at the time were saying, Europeans are claiming Egypt as their heritage, but it's in Africa. It's our heritage. So this plinth is representing the 3 Great Pyramids, or the 3 Pyramids of Giza. It's also representing the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom of Egypt. Another reference to the pyramids is in the star. So we have 3 points of the star, the 3 Pyramids at Giza. Also, this form right here, this female form, this is very Egyptian art history 1. You remember that composite profile view where ancient Egyptian artisans would only represent human forms from the side. We have that here with very squared off shoulders. We also have a very specific Egyptian queen hairdo right here. I'll show you an image of in just a moment. But we're not done. There are more little Easter eggs here. The stars themselves, we already know, okay, reference to pyramids. Check this out. This was commissioned by the Texas Centennial Commission for the celebration of Texas's independence from Mexico. Texas is the quote-unquote Lone Star State. So Douglas is including that, but in his coded language of referencing back to Egyptian African heritage. These stars are also referenced to the North Star, which many slave narratives describe as the sort of way to get them to the north, follow the North Star to the north to escape slavery. So we've got the star here. And then one more thing on this slide I want to show you is this circle form. And we have a radiating circle. We have radiating circles over here. Douglas firmly believed that jazz was the quintessential African-American art form, and the music waves are what these circles are representing, the spread of jazz, the spread of African-American accomplishment through jazz and music. So I mentioned these forms. This particular form is in reference to an ancient Egyptian queen, the mother of Akhenaten, the very controversial Egyptian king. These 2 forms on the plinth with her could be, according to art historians, a reference to Benjamin Banneker here, a very famous astronomer, urban planner, and the early part of America's history. And then this individual here with the beaker is probably a reference to George Washington Carver, the scientist. And look, they're all looking at this new city on a hill, this new Harlem Renaissance for African Americans. And then one more reference, because he couldn't stop at all of those. We go back to this form here. She's holding a book. This is a reference, according to art historians, of Michelangelo's Libyan Sibyl from the Sistine Chapel. The Libyan Sibyl was a prophetess. She could see into the future. She could help determine your fate. And Sojourner Truth is also known as the Libyan Sibyl of her own day for being able to sort of be a prophetess of what's coming, this new city on the hill through the Harlem Renaissance. So again, Aaron Douglas, and there's even more that we don't have time to get into in this painting. However, just know all of these references are very important, and they all speak to the celebration and acknowledgement that the Harlem Renaissance was about.
I want you to think about the reference to that tension about who does Egypt belong to. And we're not going to answer that today, and I do not believe there is an answer to it. But Egypt comes up again in the work of Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes is one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance. He was writing poems as young as 17. In fact, the poem that I'm going to read to you was originally written when he was 17, wasn't published until later, but It's called the Negro Speaks of Rivers. Probably his most famous piece of work, though, was The Ways of White Folks. Now, Langston Hughes he had a long influence on not just the Harlem Renaissance, but he also wrote a weekly column during the 50s and 60s and the civil rights era. Unfortunately, sadly, he developed pancreatic cancer, and he died on May 22nd, 1967. However, just a few weeks, maybe about a month before he died, he actually wrote a letter to our campus, to the AMC Cancer Center at Denver, which was the new evolution of the JCRS campus, of which REMCAD purchased in 2002. So a little connection there. Go ahead. And this is his grave. His ashes are buried inside of a New York Public Library Research Center in Harlem, and you can see the rivers. And what he's using rivers as the connection that ties the African and the African American experience together. He's using rivers as his thread. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. This theme of rivers and the connections between Africa and African Americans.
So speaking of migration and rivers and flowing, right, we do have visual culture evidence of the migration itself. You can see here on the left an image of a family making their way from the south to the north. What we also have is artistic representation, and we can look to the painting on the right by Jacob Lawrence, who I know, again, if you've taken any art history, he is typically, along with Aaron Douglas, one of the two, perhaps three artists always discussed in terms of the Harlem Renaissance. His most famous work is this series of paintings depicting from about 1910 to 1940 scenes of the Great Migration. What he calls his series the Migration of the Negro. So what's important to remember about him from this particular slide is he was trained by Augusta Savage, who we will talk about. She's rarely included in any survey. And he was married to Gwendolyn Knight, and he taught at Black Mountain College. So let's take a look at some of his most notable works. But first, let's talk about what he was doing in Harlem. So after his parents divorced, he moved to Harlem. He took some free classes at the Harlem Community Arts Center. And check out this image on the right. This is an actual poster from 1939. It was designed then. Again, graphic designers of the day, African-American designers of the day, ahead of the game, for sure. But you can see this image on the left of children receiving free art education in Harlem. And here's an image of Jacob Lawrence on the left. He then became an educator. He was still a practicing artist, but in his later years, he became an educator at the Lincoln School in New York. And his most famous painting, always included in art history survey text, is one about the Black experience. In particular, one of the largest race riots occurred in East St. Louis, which is at the MoMA. It is part of that series about the Great Migration. So it documents police brutality, it documents riots, it documents the migration itself and all issues related to it. And I just want to say, he did this when he was 22, 23 years old. He did this series of paintings. Amazing.
I would just point out, too, that the connection to the modern-day Black Lives Movement, that's where Michael Brown was murdered, was East St. Louis.
Absolutely. Chandra, this is a slide specifically for you, so buckle up, it's complicated. In the image on the left, we see a photograph of teachers at Black Mountain College at the Summer Institute in 1946. Black Mountain College, of course, the iconic art school, other than the Bauhaus. But the iconic art school here in the States in the early part of the 20th century. Here is Jacob Lawrence. Here is his wife, Gwendolyn Knight, who we'll mention in just a minute. Here is Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus in Germany. Here is Joseph and Annie Albers, teachers at the Bauhaus before World War II, and here they are in their later years with one of Albers' works. Another connection to REMCAD from the Harlem Renaissance is that Jacob Lawrence and his wife Gwendolyn were at Black Mountain College around the same time that Buckminster Fuller taught at Black Mountain College. He, of course, is the very famous architect and designer interested in geodesic domes, from which Clark Reichert, REMCAD professor of the past, still active artist, designed Drop City here in Denver, and also the Dome on our beautiful campus. So lots of connections, deep connections to the Bauhaus, to really important artists of the 20th century right here at RimCat. So Jacob Lawrence, he married Gwendolyn Knight, who was also a Harlem Renaissance artist. They lived well into the 2000s. I believe she passed in 2004, and here they are, still as in love as ever, but she was an artist in her own right. Her most famous work is this portrait bust of Augusta Savage. And who was Augusta Savage? She is who I call, because nobody else will, the mother of the movement. She educated so many Harlem Renaissance artists, and she had such an impact on so many artists during this period. She was married to one of the associates of Marcus Garvey, we talked about earlier. When she was young, her father did not want her to be an artist. He was a minister, and she recounted that he used to beat me so much when he would catch me drawing that he almost beat the art right out of me. So when she was young, she decided to leave Florida, come to New York for an art career with only $4.60 in her pocket. And you can see here her list of accolades. Her two most famous works include this portrait bust of her nephew on the left, and this work on the right, Lift Every Voice and Sing, also known as the harp. And this, again, it's a celebration of identity. It's a celebration of community. It's an uplifting of the Black experience, African-American lives and experiences in art, and sharing that with everyone. So Augusta Savage, even though she's rarely included in any textbooks, she is the sort of, in my opinion, the spine behind all of these Harlem Renaissance artists. Of which, another one we know about, and I know we have a fan of Romeo Bearden here with us today. He, of course, a modernist artist of the period, but look, this work is from 1964. We're well beyond that 1940 date, but again, the Harlem Renaissance didn't stop just because art historians said it stopped in 1940. These artists lived on, continued working. And what Romeo Bearden is doing here, and I know Dr. Keefe wants to talk to you about the cat, but before he does, I want to tell you what he's doing in these important collage and photo montage works. He is looking back to the history of art. And if you've ever taken a class with me, you know what I always say. Dr. B always says, art history never goes away. Any artist worth his or her salt knows their art history. Romeo Bearden did. He's looking back to the 16th century at artists like Bruegel, and he's noticing, right, these people, they're just living their lives. Well, he says, well, the Black experience has never been presented this way. We just live our lives too. And so his collages, his photo montages are speaking to this sort of genre scene in art history, but with the Black American experience. Dr. Keefe?
Oh, now we get to talk about the cat now?
Yeah, we get to talk about the cat.
Well, first I want to know, do you think this is Mikey named after Michelangelo, Rusty named after Rustum from ancient Persia, or it could be Tuttle, it could be the one that he had named after the great King Tut, or I dare you, do you know who he is? Do you know who the fourth cat is, Dr. B?
Starts with a G.
This is Gippo. This is Gippo, his tabby. Can we talk about the cats for the rest of the presentation now?
Absolutely. Cats in art history, that's next week. Wonderful. Romeo Bearden loved cats, and yes, he named his cats after artists, after leaders, after King Tut, so again, that Egypt reference. But again, he was reinserting the Black experience into the history of Western art because he noticed it wasn't there, right? This reclamation of identity. Another artist we need to talk about that is only, since I've started teaching, which has been about 10 years, this artist has recently started to be included in art history survey texts. It's photographer James Van Der Zee, such a talented photographer. He is certainly looking at 19th century pictorialist tradition. You can see in the image on the left, the sort of mother and child referencing Christ and Mary composition, but most of his works are hand painted or hand manipulated after development, which you can get a sense of here. And here he is looking so dapper, so fly in his self-portrait on the right. He lived a very long life too. But I want to talk about this photograph here. And it's one I've recently learned about, and I've been looking into Van Der Zee for quite some time. This is called Man in Chains, or Escape Artist. And it has been argued that this is Van Der Zee's sort of response to the enslavement of Africans. Again, looking back at what Alain Locke would call the old Negro experience. But if we really give Van Der Zee the art historical attention that we give Western artists, we would realize that this is perhaps the famous magician of color called the Great Bromo of the vaudeville scene in the early 20th century. We don't know for sure if this is the Great Bromo. There aren't a lot of records that talk about him. Of course, circuses and vaudeville and things like that didn't keep a lot of their ephemera, posters, tickets, things like that. So much more work needs to be done on this, but what a fascinating art historical research project to find out who this is. And again, I would argue it's not a commentary on enslavement, just because James Van Der Zee's work, like Harlem Renaissance artist, was a celebration. So this would have been a celebration of this talent of him breaking into the vaudeville scene and making a name for himself.
I'm glad you mentioned vaudeville. There's the well-known vaudeville, but part of the purpose for these LA luncheons is we want to talk about the history that you're not getting. There was an entire second vaudeville called Black Vaudeville. It was more of a traveling vaudeville. It wasn't just located in New York City, and probably the most famous Black Vaudeville act would be by Pat Chappelle and the famous Rabbit Foot Company, which was the first all-Black entertainment unit. But I also want to talk about, in this era, this roaring 20s, where everything's great and everybody's happy, and in our typically on our history textbooks, you know, it's just all sunshine. Why is it that Augustus Savage had to get an award in Paris? Why is it that Dr. Locke got that degree from Oxford? Why is it that people are looking towards Europe? Well, first of all, there had been the Harlem Hellfighters unit in World War I, which General John Pershing transferred to French command because US officers were uncomfortable with African Americans holding weapons. And so the African American community remembered, communal memory, the fact that they had been accepted in France in ways that they were not accepted in their own country. You've probably heard about the emigre movement to Paris, the expats movement, Hemingway, for example, but there was an entire expats Black movement to Europe, okay? And in fact, when they eventually built the Apollo in 1934, the very first act that was shown, Adelaide Hall, was one of those Black emigres. She was an American who renounced her citizenship and became British, again, because she felt more comfortable in Britain than she did in her own country. Just think, if you're a Downton Abbey fan, think about season 4, when they introduced the African-American jazz musician. That's the era, that's the emigre community that I'm referring to. We're going to go right into the Great Depression, I think, on the next slide. So 1934 would be after the Great Depression had started, and I wanted to show you this quote from Christopher Klein, last hired, first fired, that we know that in the first Great Depression, that 25% to 30% of all Americans, regardless of race, were unemployed. But we have documented records of African Americans being fired in order to preserve the jobs of white Americans. So it hit everybody, but it particularly hit the Black community.
So within the Harlem Renaissance, as we talked about with Dr. Locke's book, right, poets, artists, musicians, playwrights. So there were other forms of visual culture, culture in general, with prominent figures, prominent performers, entertainers. You know the names: Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, of course, Billie Holiday. There's also actress and fashion icon Josephine Baker, which many of you have probably heard about. She is remembered for her risque performances. She was gorgeous. Look at this photo, glamour, right? She was also a spy in World War II for the Allied forces. Because she was so well known for her beauty, for her charm, for her seductive ways, she was able to, as the quote, Creole goddess of France, infiltrate these meetings of Axis leaders and gather information for the Allied forces in France. So, you know, it's more than just entertainment. Again, it's about a celebration and an uplifting of culture. And these are the histories you're not going to find in textbooks.
So when we talked about doing this project, doing this presentation, part 1 is titled Harlem Renaissance More Than Art. We talked about the Great Migration. We've talked about World War I. We've talked about the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and all of the vibrancy of the Harlem Renaissance within all of those other themes of history. And we're gonna wrap it up today with World War II, and we're gonna set the stage then for part two, which is going to come out of World War II and the African American experience in World War II, and moving into the Civil Rights Movement all the way up today to Black Lives Matter.
Thank you for being here. Now we want to open it up to you for questions, for comments. If anybody's interested in co-presenting with us next week or in weeks following on topics of your choice that, again, you're not going to find in your history books of underrepresented, overlooked, intentionally overlooked voices, let us know, but the floor is yours.